Let me see if I can get the presentation uploaded. How do I share screen here? Share screen.
So, yeah.
Here we go. Can everyone see this?
Yes, we can.
And what do you see, a full slide presentation now, or are you seeing my presented view?
I see your presented view.
Okay. Let me see if we can do that in a different way. Better now?
Yes, that's
All
all
right.
good.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. My apologies for the late arrival. You all caught the message. I'm on the other side of the world in the Netherlands at the moment, and it's quite early here still. But great that I get an opportunity to talk to you here at the end of the program. We'll be talking about design thinking today, and design research in particular, and explaining a little bit about ontologies, methodologies, and the real world relevance. So first introducing myself, I'm Xander Lub. I live in the Netherlands and work for Utrecht University of Applied Sciences. I'm a full professor of organizations in digital transition. And I also am a research fellow at the Vrije University in Amsterdam and Nijrode Business University, which is a private business school that's quite well known in this part of the world. And I have about 25 years of experience in higher education, and 20 of those are actually in hospitality management education. And I hold editorial roles at Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Management, Contemporary Hospitality Management, International Hospitality Management, Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research, and Group and Organization Management, which is a more general management journal. And although my research is quite wide, I think what connects it all is that I'm interested in how people make sense of and absorb changes in their environments into their everyday working lives. So the warming up was meant for you, but I think I'm the one that needs the warming up here, given that I'm the one that just woke up. I'm not sure if you can actually talk or just listen, but you can talk? Great. Okay. You can talk? Great. Okay.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Lovely. So a little warming up before we start with the session, because I think it's important to get in the right thinking mode when we talk about the topic. So a little puzzle for you. And you've got here 9 dots. And in your mind, consider how you can make 4 straight connected lines. So if you were having a drawing device, if you put it on the paper, you're going to have to connect it by drawing 4 lines, and they need to be connected. You would not be able to lift off your drawing device off the surface. How would you draw that? And I only need 1 or 2 answers, because otherwise there's going to be too many. I don't know how many people are in a meeting, but a little tough to start with. All right. So what do we see here? People didn't come up with this solution. And the reason for that probably is because you were thinking it needs to be within the realm of those 9 dots. I'm not allowed to go outside. Let's make it a little harder. 3 straight connected lines. Does anyone have an idea? Nobody said you had to go through the middle of the dot, right? All right, now we're going to make it really hard. 1 line. Any ideas? All right. So with a white brush stroke, you can actually touch all of them in one time. So all of the 3 puzzles actually tell us one thing, is that there are different ways of looking at problems, and they often are outside the box. All right. before I get into the story, I want to tell a little bit about my personal background in relation to this topic, because I think, like most of us, we were trained at university. In my case, I started off with a master in clinical and health psychology, and then did a PhD in organizational psychology. By that time, I'd already started working at hotel school, so you can imagine that hospitality management is really a management field, and I was interested in the topic. In all cases, I was basically brought up, like most of us, with a rather positivist view of the world. The truth is out there for us to find as long as we measure it well, and there's one single truth. For the few lucky of us, particularly the ones in the tourism domain, we realize that there's also another way of finding the truth, and that is in a more qualitative way, where you can accept that people may have different opinions, and those can be cherished. Well, already during my PhD, I noticed that what we call measuring well is up for debate in hospitality management research, and to be quite frank, in general management research as well. Are we truly measuring what is happening? Are we capturing context when we measure things? Do we understand why people make decisions or why they have certain attitudes? And I don't mean the mediated moderation models where we put in one variable and that explains the world. Are we capturing different perspectives? Perhaps not also not always. And one thing that I really ran into is when I look in psychology field, and there's a lot of dynamic processes going on. People change over time. And I have the feeling we weren't measuring that appropriately. So that was the first encounter where I thought my positive view of the world perhaps has limitations. And we're probably not measuring really what's going on at all times. So my first encounter with design thinking was actually through an article by Dunn and Martin. They both work at Rotman School of Management in Vancouver. Sorry, not in Vancouver, in Toronto. And they basically shifted their business school to take different approaches to understanding the field that they're working in. And they did a wonderful interview-based article in the Academy of Management Learning and Education on how design thinking would change or should change management education. And they were followed up by many articles in Academy of Management journals and organization science and a lot of special issues in broad management journals on how design research is another approach to solving some of our research questions. It wasn't until 2012 when I had my first lived encounter with design research. I was asked by the hospitality organization that represents hospitality entrepreneurs in the Netherlands to collaborate in a future scenarios project for the Dutch hospitality industry. And we're working with a lot of people from our statistics office who were doing the usual scenario reports based on numbers. And I actually participated in those and helped write them. And that year we decided to do things a little differently. And we got a strategic designer from Philips. And Philips is a company that builds electronics. And the strategic designer basically proposed to do a future scenario project in a very different way. And I can tell you it was an 8-month project. And the first 3 months, I probably battled with her, saying that there was no actual evidence for what she was saying. And her methods didn't make any sense. And it was all very soft and vague. And after 3 months, I decided that we're not going to get any further. Let's just dive into this and see what happens. And what I found out during the project is that even though some of the things on the surface seemed very soft and vague and unstructured, the reality was that the process was actually very structured and had very clear methodologies that helped find out answers in that scenario project. And to be also quite honest, if I look at the results we got from that project, they were all about future scenarios, but they were all really damn accurate in their findings, much more so than I would have expected. So management thinking versus design thinking. And management thinking, I will also go into more scientific approaches, but let's just first have a look at our world. If you look at industries around us, and I do realize this is probably not the best sketch, is that if you look at industries, they can be broken down into 4 quadrants according to 2 dimensions: predictability and malleability. And if you look, Over here is hotels, restaurants, and leisure, which is our industry. We're an industry that, actually is not so predictable. I mean, we deal with a lot of crises, a lot of shifts in economy, and we're usually one of the first industries to be hit. But it's also an industry that is shaped easily. We're an industry that consists of a lot of small and medium or even micro enterprises, where a lot of them go broke in a year, but a lot of new ones come up as well. So it's an industry that is on the one hand dynamic, but on the other hand, it's also quite unpredictable. And if you look, most industries that we know, the big ones, are actually in this field below, or are they? So this is where we are. But the two styles of managing companies that are most used in 75% of the cases, also in hotels, restaurants, and leisures, are styles that are classical, your industry is predictable, you can't change it, or visionary, your industry is not so predictable, and you can't change it. And those two are used in 75% of the cases. Now, digital transformation and COVID and many other big events in the last 20 years have shown us that the way we look at that world is perhaps not entirely correct anymore, and the way we solve problems isn't either. And there is a couple of examples of that. If you look at the world's largest taxi company, it owns no taxis. The largest accommodation provider owns no real estate. The largest phone companies own no telecom infrastructure. The world's most valuable retailer has no inventory. The most popular media owner creates no content, and so forth and so forth. And what we're seeing here is basically that because business models, particularly digital online business models, have really changed how we look at our industries and how we operate in our industries, and they're changing dramatically. And that basically creates a new world, and that new world probably requires different ways of looking at them. And this model here is a model that can be used to understand that. And it's a model by Dave Snowden. It's called the Kinefin model. And basically what it says is that we have different ways of looking at, and it could be society, it could be ecosystems, or it could be, let's focus on organizations right now. And most of the ways, what we do is when we, I'm not entirely awake, guys, so I'm not sure what to have going on here, but here we go. Most of the times we try and approach problems or issues in what we call a simple way. And by the simple way, I mean that there's a relationship between cause and effect that is obvious to all. We know what the question is that we need to start with. We have a rough idea of what the final answer is going to be, and we understand how to get there. So you could see that as sense categorized response. You understand this is what we need to do. You categorize the possibilities, and you respond to the question that is at hand. A lot of organizations try to operate this way, and hotels are no stranger in that with their standard operating procedures. However, not all problems are simple. There are also complicated problems. And in that case, the relationship between cause and effect requires analysis or some other form of investigation or application of expert knowledge. And in that case, you need some adaptability in your program. And what we do in that case, we try to understand what is the problem, we analyze the problem, and we respond. But the response is dependent on an analysis that helps us understand what is the best way to respond. Whereas in the first case, the answer is pretty clear. Now, these two types of practices are used in most organizations. However, if you look at the world we live in, it's increasingly becoming a complex world. And complex by that I mean is that when you start out, you're not entirely sure where you're going to end up. Because by the time we figured out a solution for a problem, the problem may have shifted already. And therefore the solution may also have shifted. And I think it's also very clear, for instance, in the strategy literature, 20 years ago, strategy could be described as an A to B, and there's a straight line between them. And that's the way that you follow to execute your strategy. Right now, strategy is actually moved from a straight line to several straight lines with possible outcomes, the scenario approach. And what we're seeing right now is that strategy is something that is malleable and fluxes around time to get to a point that we yet don't know. I remember this clearly when I had a meeting with the C-suite of a hotel organization in the Netherlands, and they just came out of a strategy meeting. And I asked them, so, strategy meeting. So what strategy are you looking at? Well, they were looking at the strategy of Q1. And I think that's quite illustrative of how we build strategy these days. I mean, oil companies in the 80s used to build strategy for 30 years, and our horizon for strategy has reduced and reduced. And the reason is that the relationship between cause and effect can only be really perceived in retrospect. We don't know what the relationship is at the moment in many cases. There are still simple problems, there are still complicated problems, but if you look at the industrial revolution that we're in right now, we need a different way of looking at problems. And that is not anymore trying to identify a question, but probing what the question might be, finding out what the responses are to the tests that we do, and then respond to those and adjust. So there's a more iterative process now in place that helps us understand our environment and what is the best way to deal with this. And we call this emergent practice. And finally, there's the chaotic environment. And in that case, there's no relationship between cause and effect at the systems level. And the only thing we can do is respond to what's at hand. And as we respond, or as we act, we need to figure out what impact that has and adjust accordingly to find out what is the best way. And I think that COVID is a prime example of that, where we were faced with a situation that we did not have a roadmap for. Even though we have crisis roadmaps in all countries and also most organizations, this was a case where we did not exactly know what was going on, because we didn't know what the disease would do, how impactful it will be, etc., etc. There aren't really any research scenarios for this kind of thing, but the reality is something that we need to deal with. And I think the war in Ukraine, for instance, is another example of that, where basically on a day-to-day basis, we're adjusting, reinventing, they're reinventing themselves and trying to come up with new ways to combat each other. All right, so basically what we're saying here is that we have three types of problems. You have known knowns, which means that you know how to solve the problem. For instance, if it rains outside, you know that you need to grab an umbrella when you go outside or put on a rain jacket. And this is a type of problem where you have checklists and automatic problem solving, or SOPs, as we call them in our industries. The second category is what we call known unknowns. You know how to find the information that you need to solve the problem. So in other words, you understand the question, but the exact answer needs some further analysis. For instance, your car stopped working. You can adjust and isolate categories, or you can take it to the mechanic, which is another way of dealing with the problem. And in that case, what you're doing is you're testing, you're searching, using analytic, what we call left brain thinking. And then finally, we have the unknown unknowns. In the last picture, those were the complex and the chaotic problems. In that case, we have big blind spots. You don't know what you don't know. So there's a root cause issue there. And a typical one is that you see customers are not buying your product, but you have no idea what it is. And simple analysis doesn't seem to help in some way. And in that case, what you need is immersion, engagement, or design thinking research. So in terms of ontology, this is what it is. Known knowns are a deductive logic. And basically deductive logic tells us that there is one objective truth. And that means that you can work from theory. There is a way to framework the world and a way to justify how you make decisions in the process. And we all know this when we try and submit to journals. There's always theory. Everything needs to be theory driven. And with deductive logic, there's a what, and there's a clear how, and there's therefore a clear result. So this is the way that most articles that we write in a more quantitative way are done. We also know, and some reviewers are not so good at that, is that there's a form of inductive logic, in which case there are multiple subjective truths. And in that case, there may not be an exact theory for the problem you're trying to solve. So what do? you ask research questions, and based on how much theory or how much empirical evidence already is available, you try and at least fill your backpack with some knowledge about the topic, and then you go on your way, do interviews, do focus groups, and you will get a result. So in that case, although the question is relatively clear, the path may not be so clear. You can describe it to some extent, but you need to be flexible in understanding what people tell you, how to adjust your questions to it, and that will, in the end, will get you to a result. And then finally, and this is a type of logic that is not often mentioned, but was already mentioned by the early Greek philosophers, is abductive logic. And in abductive logic, actually, it is no longer about truths. Because there are multiple truths you can create, and really what is important is value. What is it that you can create? So you're no longer looking for the optimal solution, you're looking for a working solution. And often this happens in value-driven contexts, and this is why it's often also related to, for instance, user-centric or human-centered research, where people's values matter in the solutions that you're making. So what's unique with this kind of logic is that you're not going to be able to get a clear starting question. You can start off with a question, you can say analyzing problem, but there's always going to be multiple viewpoints on that problem. In some cases, and design, I'll show you some examples of the methods in a little while in the presentation. The how do we get to an answer, or how do we get to value in this case? There are a lot of ways of doing it, but there are also cases where we don't know yet. And that, for instance, applies to the chaotic situation. The question isn't clear, how we're going to get to the answer or the value is not clear, but there are ways to get there, and we just need to get on our way and start experimenting. So this is a third form of logic, and that is one of the forms of logic that is applied in design research. So it's a little bit like this metaphor of the four guys that are blind and trying to figure out what they're holding. And one that holds the trunk, and he says, "Oh, an elephant is like a big snake." And the guy that's holding the leg says, "Actually, no, it's like a tree stump." And the third says, "What are you saying? It's like a shaft of leather." And the fourth says, "You're all wrong. It's actually like a little furry mouse." And they're all right, but they're all only seeing part of the picture. And this is the type of problems that we deal with in design research, or in complex problems or chaotic problems. And in order to get a complete answer, it means that you have to work together. I think that we're increasingly doing in society, and even now in academia, you see that there's much more multi or interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary research happening. And that is tough because we all have our own languages and we all have our own methodologies. But in the end, this is a way to get a broader scope on what is exactly the problem beyond your own set of knowledge. So design thinking is like a human-centered and collaborative approach to problem solving, using a design mindset to solve complex problems. And complex problems are what we call wicked problems, problems that are not clear at the start, and problems that we try by iteratively revisiting that problem, by trying out things, by trying to find answers or solutions. We're going to get parts of the picture right. So it also means that it's not a chronological process. But design research uses deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. If I look at that scenario project I did, even though there was a lot of very creative seeking for information, in the end, we're also testing a lot of that information against other forms of knowledge. So we're doing a lot of triangulation with harder evidence. Design research is actually has been around for at least 100 years, and it originates from product design, but is now expanded to deal with many other contexts. And service is a key one, particularly anything that involves end users. With experienced design, with education, we're trying to get more creative with that, but also organizational and even societal problems are now captured and understood through design processes. So it works well with those wicked problems that I was just explaining. And it's particularly useful when you're trying to understand a user's needs and ambitions, but then we're talking about deeper needs. It's not the kind of needs that when you ask somebody, what is it you want? they're going to be able to tell you that. It's something that you need to delve and dig deeper for. And there's a great quote by Verganti, who is a product designer. And basically what he says, people do not buy products, but they buy meaning. People use things for profound emotional, psychological, and societal reasons, as well as utilitarian ones. And firms should therefore look beyond features, functions, and performance and understand the real meaning users give to things. And I think this very much also applies to our fields of research, because in hotels, you're always trying to excel people's expectations. And the problem with expectations is we don't really know what they are, because even if you ask people about their expectations, they're not going to be able to give you the full picture. But you do need to be able to touch them emotionally when they visit your hotel, and you need to create memories for them. And for that, you need to connect to their values. You need to connect to emotional drivers, psychological drivers that make them want to visit your hotel. And it's not just a service where they need a bed, but they're looking for an experience. And that experience is often very vaguely defined by them. And it's really something that you need to identify in other ways. So you'll have ways to raise your hand. Can you raise your hand and tell me who here designs after hearing this? I can't see any hands here. Can you? Ah, there's one. Very good. I should raise my own hand as well, because I believe I design. All right. So
Anita and myself, yes.
That's not a lot. Let's reframe that. So everyone designs who devise courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So do we have more designers in the room now? I would argue that we all are designers. We may be researchers that are following certain procedures, but in our lives, this is what we do every day. In our relationships, this is what we do every day. In our work, this is what we do every day. And I would even argue that in some of the research that we're doing, we are getting pretty damn creative in creating truths and developing truths in our process. All right, so I'm just breaking down, and it's not a fair breakdown, because in this case we have a rational analytic approach on the one hand, and design thinking on the other hand. And I think that our qualitative approach sort of sits a little bit in the middle. But for the purpose of clarification, I think this works. So if you look, then they have very different ways of operating. And it took me a lot of time to get used to it, and a lot of frustration as well. But if you look at problem formulation, in rational analytic cases, we're looking at well-defined goals and constraints. Whereas in design thinking, the goals and constraints are uncovered in the process. With regards to criteria, we're looking for objective definitions of criteria before we start generating alternatives. And in the case of design thinking, both objective and subjective criteria are used to define objectives. And the user, the end user, is the ultimate judge of your result. So the method, in the case of rational, is planning and analysis. Thoughts precede action, and it's a sequential process. And in the case of design thinking, it's what we call an iterative exploration of the design space. Thinking and doing are intertwined. So iteration means that you try something, you find a result, and you develop further on this. So this is a little bit what happens in engineering, or it's what happens in medicine, although they have more evidence-based medicine now. But I think even law is, to some extent, is an iterative science. And there's a number of sciences that actually are operating in this. ICT is another one, although they have a more technical and defined approach to designing software. There's also a lot of this iterative exploration going on there. So information processing emphasis in a case of rational research is on the preference for objective formulations, particularly verbal and quantitative. And in the case of design thinking, we're seeing much more of a focus on visual and spatial representations, because those do not just evoke objective, but also subjective insights. People respond to visual cues because it activates a different part of their brain, and it activates their mental schemas in different ways. So it will allow you to get to knowledge that you won't be able to get to with a questionnaire or an interview question, because that targets and elicits cognitive responses. The solution process is based on rational logic reasoning. In the case of rational, over time, you create a formalized set of rules, which we also call theory. And in design thinking cases, solutions evolve as a result of interaction with users and creation, refinement of solutions. And they tend to be more unique for that specific situation. The rationale, get it right, reduce chance of failure through careful prior analysis. And this is the CYA approach, or the cover your ass approach, that is also used in management a lot, but it is also an approach that we use in science. Although I must say that during my PhD, I've also identified that, and in the publication process, that we actually do a lot of iterative thinking about our research in the analysis process, in the review process, and we tend to adjust our findings accordingly as well. But that's probably the story that people don't tell you when you start out at this job. And in the case of design thinking, what is used is what we call rapid experimentation and prototyping to learn from early cheap failures. So the idea is that you're not looking for the perfect answer, you're looking for 1,000 wrong answers, because they help you find out what it's not. And Thomas Edison famously said is that I did not, when he experimented a lot with that light bulb that he invented, he said, I did not fail 1,000 times. I just found 1,000 ways that didn't work. And they helped me find the right solution. So in the case of rational, the outcome is always a solution that optimizes predefined criteria to arrive at the best answer. And in the case of design thinking, it's about finding better answers. And the process may expose even alternatives to that as well. So what's the process in the design research case? This is a 5-step approach. There's also a 4-step approach. There's a 3-step approach. There's probably about 50 different approaches as a process to design research. And they depend on the context, they depend on the people, and they depend on the assignment. This is the one that's called the Stanford 5 approach. It was developed at Stanford University and basically has 5 phases: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And this looks really comfortable because it looks like a sequential process you can follow. You do empathize, then you define from the results of that, then you ideate, prototype, and then you test. It's almost like a waterfall approach in project management. Reality is much more fuzzy and iterative than this. But let's just go by one phase at a time. The first phase, empathize, is about searching for rich stories and finding some low. In other words, what we mean by that is we're trying to understand the user in their context and what is important to them, what are their values, and what is it they're really needing? What is the pain or the issue that you're trying to solve for them? And that's not the issue usually what you find by asking them, but it's something you need to dig into by understanding how their context is changing, by looking at how they behave in a certain context, and by asking questions or having them draw answers. And it's pretty amazing what you can identify if you open up yourself to what they're telling, even though they don't really know what they're telling themselves at the time. When you do the empathize phase, you collect a lot of data, and those data remain in the process for the entire process. You don't make any final decisions until you get to the end of the process. But the empathize phase sets you up for much better identification in the next phases. And in defining, by that time, you have identified what is the user, what is his or her needs, and what are insights you've been getting from those. And they create a point of view that is a departing point for what we call an ideation process. And an ideation process is not about getting the perfect idea, it's about getting 100 really bad ideas or super crazy ideas, and then testing some of them, or iterating with them, or playing with them, or combining them by looking back at empathizing, seeing what combinations would work here. So the yes and approach is not no but, it's always yes and. You're always generating more ideas. This can take some time, but it helps you perhaps also look back at defining and looking back at empathizing. Once you've done that, you start building prototypes. And building prototypes are not all maquettes that we're building of a hotel. It can be many different forms. It could be a story. It could be a visual or a video. It could be even something that you act out or play. Or it could be just really simple mock-ups or VR. It could be many, many different things. What you do with a prototype, you're looking for something that represents your solution in a cheap way. And why a cheap way? Because you want to be able to prototype a lot of the times and throw them away, adjust them, make them better. So in the car industry, this is already well known. They have the clay models for cars. They had them in the past where basically the clay model was cheaper than building a full car and then finding out it didn't work. And nowadays, a lot of it's actually happening in the computer. I don't know who of you follows Formula One. I'm a big fan, particularly since the Dutchman is now the world champion. But what happens in the factory is that they said, okay, the Red Bull team, for those of you that don't know, Red Bull is the team that became world champion this year. And they were punished because they spent too much money this year, but they overwent their budget. And as a punishment, they were allowed less wind tunnel time. And wind tunnel time is really important for Formula One cars because aerodynamics is everything when you make a quick lap on the course. But Red Bull doesn't mind too much because they're already doing so much sim racing and they're doing so much modeling in the computer at the moment that actually helps them more than the wind tunnel these days. So this is a system where you can just run 1,000 different solutions. And although it costs you money, it costs you relatively little money compared to actually putting. A really important car on a really expensive car on the track. So the prototyping goes on for a little while, and then finally you're coming up with a more permanent solution, and then you test that with users again. And sometimes that means you test and you find out that it fails, and you start all over from the start again and do it as many times as possible. Now, this sounds like a really complicated process, but it is a process that really allows you to delve into something that creates value. And it is also something that can be done in a relatively simple way. So we run this with hotel school students for 5 years in the Netherlands together with the industry. And we did boot camps where altogether they spent half a year in this process, but they were doing that on top of their own courses. And they would, if you look at the effective time they spent on it, it was probably 20 days. And they came up with great solutions. Many of those were actually being implemented in the industry. So this is another way of identifying processes. It's called the double diamond. It is by the British Design Society. Again, it's a similar way of approaching, but now they've got a more structured picture for it. And what is important about this one is in the process, what you do is you start off with divergent thinking, and then you come back to more convergent thinking. You're trying to find first they define a problem or a design brief. And when you do that, then you can start doing divergent thinking again, create lots of solutions, and then come to deliver convergent thinking. This is a more specific solution. So this is a more simplified picture that relates back to the Stanford's 5-step. And I think this is probably something that happens a lot in ICT solutions. So if you look at design as a business tool, it is something that closely studies people in context. And context is really important here, trying to understand how people operate in a specific context and why they do the things that they do. And it's an intrinsic part of any new product or service innovation activity. And design is one of those disciplines that encompass multidisciplinarity in their collaboration, and it also follows a system approach known as design thinking. And it intrinsically requires us to be our human selves. So it is really uncomfortable when you've never done this and you get in the process for the first time, because you actually have to allow yourself to feel what is happening in the situation, beyond just trying to find a cognitive solution. Because then you will find that there is actually, you at some point understand why people behave the way they do. And I've seen quite a few examples where we are developing personas, which are representations of groups of consumers based on a limited number of, well, I could call them interviews, but they're really quite intensive, long sessions with people. And you really delve into what is your issue here? What would make your life better? And we would spend days finding that out with those people, only to find out that even though their solution or their their value driver or their problem was actually at a very basic, deep level, was something that was probably shared by most humans. Even though you were looking at one person in one specific context, if you dig deep enough, you're actually going to find that you're creating solutions that work for people. One of my favorite examples is the iPhone, because I think that is when it was brought on the market, it completely changed everything we thought about phones. And it was really because they were looking at a product and then we're seeing something else when you look at it from the user perspective. And there's also a couple of hotel chains that do this, like Zoku or Citizen M in their design. They've followed similar approaches as well. So it's defined as a discipline that connects people's needs with what is technological feasible and viable from a strategy point of view in order to create customer value. So it integrates human needs, aspirations, context, technology, interfaces along a timeline. So I'll show you an example of that in a second. And it's innovative as it does not use competition as a benchmarking principle. And it's also, we talked a lot about that, not linear. It diverges and converges along the way. So I'm not going to go over all of these, but what I described to you is a process that doesn't sound structured. You have to make decisions along the way, and you have to feel things, and it seems like it cannot really be defined what's happening. But that is true because you are not limiting yourself to certain solutions. But if you look at the process, if you look at the way they organize the research in this area, it is actually quite well identified. And they're usually short sessions with very clearly defined goals and very clearly defined context and time limits. And time limits are really important in design research, because if you force people to come up with as many solutions in a short amount of time, people are getting away from, I need to give the perfect answer here. Because the perfect answer is not the right answer. The perfect answer is finding as many bad answers and then putting them together to make sense of what really could be the answer. And as you can see, this is another way, again, this is a 3-step way of design, but it's just a way of sorting how you can look at people. And for instance, a lot of it is ethnographic research, such as interview or contextual inquiry or walk a mile immersion, is where you basically follow them for a while, or fly on the wall is when you follow them without them knowing, and trying to understand what are people doing and why would they be doing that. And then participatory research, there's for instance very clear sort of templates that you can use for how people are describing what people do. So journaling is, for instance, one where you would write almost like a journal article explaining what people were experiencing, what they discovered, and what solution they came up with. And because it's like a journal article, people can, the respondent can actually look at it from a distance and say, oh, is this me? Or need to adjust the story? Is it a little different? Did I look at it different? So basically there's a lot of ways and a lot of templates that are being used in this. And for those of you that are into business modeling and business model canvas, this is all based on these kinds of methodologies. So that looks a little bit like this, a whole bunch of people. And if you look up here, for instance, in the empathize phase, what we've created here is what we call timelines. Follow a person for a day. What does their day look like? And identify what is important to them at one point. So you're basically following their rhythm and you're asking them to tell about what's happening on a daily basis with that. And then you start highlighting what's important where, what indications may this give about needs that they have. And as you saw in the last picture, basically there's a lot of post-its that are being used in the process. Did you identify what emotions might they have? Were they doing it in a social context? Were they doing it alone? And all of those elements help in understanding what's happening here. And when they get that done, you start selecting and identifying from all of those observations that you find on such a day. And that allows you to build what we call personas. And personas are basically representations of users in a certain group. In this case, this was Anne. We did this in the Future Scenarios project, and Anne was a retired lady that was quite active and was looking for fun ways to fill her day. And we basically, we've been with a number of ands in our project. We identified this person, and based on her needs and her behavior and the kind of trends that were going on in society, we were capturing solutions for this user. This was a longer process, which I won't completely cover. But in essence, what you're doing here is, because at some point you start understanding the user so well, is that you can almost think for her or think solutions for her that you would not come up with on your own. Because, for instance, this is a baby boomer. I'm not a baby boomer, although I'm sort of cusping it, I think, a little bit older than most of you probably. And baby boomers are a really important group of people to research, because they have a lot of money and they have a lot of time on their hands. So they're a great target group for our industry. And Paul, for instance, here is what we call a global nomad. And Paul was somebody that traveled around the world doing task projects and then moving on to the next phase in his world. And we came up with solutions for him as well. So this is one of the solutions we came up with for Paul, who needed a place to work and relax and meet people. And we ended up designing a space, or at least an idea for a space that could work for his needs. And as you can see, it's a very visual way of demonstrating those solutions. And what it does, it helps people understand what this could be like. And it seems, and this was one of the more futuristic one, but a lot of the things that are happening in this space are actually now part of conference and meeting spaces in some of the places in the Netherlands, because we've identified the needs along a day, working together, recharging, etc. And that helps us sort of create a different way of looking at that same space. How am I doing for time?
5 minutes.
Okay. Boy, I need to rush. I think this is clear by now. I want to get to the so what. Bring it back to our world again a little bit. Because I think one of the things we've been dealing with and not dealing with, to be honest, is what we call the academic practitioner gap. We're doing a lot of research, and we're trying to generate and demonstrate robust evidence-based insights. However, they don't seem to work in practice. And I think one of the reasons, and I hope that you have seen this from what I've presented today, is that we tend to look at a problem in a very narrow and specific way, whereas our realities, our own personal realities in our own personal lives, but also the realities of people and organizations, are much more complex than that. Their reality is changing the whole time. Their ecosystem is changing. People are changing the whole time. We've got a turnover of 40% or 50% in the industry. So it's never the same. So our structurally designed, narrowly designed solutions don't work in that environment. And I think that we need to realize that if we want to do research that becomes more relevant, is that we need to also step into their worlds and understand that there's other ways that we can do this. And it doesn't mean that we can no longer do our classic quantitative or qualitative research, but we need to combine it with the user and become more multi or interdisciplinary in the way that we look at problems and in practice. And this happens a lot already in the field. So I've just jotted out a couple of examples. For instance, strategy development started from Porter with a 5-step approach. And what we now have is value proposition canvas. Design is spread all across it, and the templates they use are all design templates. Business modeling, which is extracted from strategy, same thing. ICT and tech implementation, all design-based. Project management used to be waterfall, is agile scrum these days, and this is implemented because we realize our realities are changing all the time, and we need to come up with flexible solutions. Supply chain integration across product ecosystem, marketing, customer experience, employee journeys. All of these are examples where design is being used to come to solutions. And I just wanted to point out that design research sounds like something that is primarily creative and done by designers that create products, but it sits in a very strong tradition of ethnography, of systemic approaches to research. There's a lot of action research components in it. There is design-based research, which is an approach that combines evidence-based approaches with design-based approaches. And there's a lot of different new ways and new things that we can try as researchers if we just look around and perhaps are willing to venture beyond the realms that we seem to be limited to by our reviewers and our editors and our journals. And this is where you can dig into different ways of experimenting with that. Thank you. I don't know if there's time for questions. But...
Yes, I think there's a request, Xander, from the audience, if you would be able to share your set of slides for us at the end of the session today. And thank you for that. Do they have any comments, questions?
Thank you, Anita.
If I can ask maybe an additional question. In terms of how this is received in, well, we are the JHTM Symposium, so we're talking about also publication. How is this research translated into academic dissemination? In what way do you envision that? Because I do see the problem with having sometimes these particular research designs and ideas that are not always well received in a way. So I just want to see or hear your opinion about this.
Yeah, it sounds like a simple question, but it's not a simple question. I don't think there's any simple answers. I think my initial response is that we're slowly going to change that field. And if you look in management research, we're increasingly seeing more articles published on design thinking or design research. Having said that, it often takes a lot of time to convince people. I just demonstrated a study that I did in 2012 on scenarios. And for the focused observers, you notice that there was an article there, an article that I published in Journal of Vacation Marketing, not necessarily high end in our industry, but it took me quite a while to get that published, even in such a journal, because I had to explain a lot of things to people. So I find that if you jump into the process, it's not easy to start with, but I kept on going because I felt that we needed a new approach to look at these questions. And I think that we tend to be, also when we are reviewers ourselves, quite conservative in looking at these approaches, particularly if they're outside our own realm and we don't feel comfortable with them. But at the same time, we realize that they're necessary. So I initially only reviewed quantitative articles, and I've started reviewing qualitative stuff. I started reviewing these kind of experimental research. And because of my work at a business school, I find that it's really interesting to talk to people from different disciplines. And by now I've understood that, so I understand enough of economy or product innovation or accountancy. I'm never going to be an accountant, trust me. But I understand enough to at least jump into their world of living, their jargon, and understand what I can take from that and learn from that. So I think in economy, for instance, they've got a really crappy view of how to define variables. They just pull whatever they pull it off the net and they call it a variable, even though the actual underlying question doesn't have nothing to do with it. But I don't want to do that. But at the same time, what they do with time series analysis and the sophisticated statistics that they use, and the sort of more overall big quant view that doesn't look at individual people, but massive amounts of data, can find new things for us. Vice versa, action research can bring us really interesting insights into how things work in reality. And the same goes with design. And I think that to come up with one positive response to your question, I think what is great about design is because it's visual, it connects better to people. And I think that is one of the strong components. So if I were to publish something like this, I would make sure that I pick a journal that allows me to put visuals in there, because that makes more sense. Then it sort of all clicks with people. But you're going to have to do a lot of explaining to start with. And that's how we start a groundswell, and that's how we start publishing more on this.
Thank you. Then indeed, it's a fascinating space. I've been looking at Lego Serious Play myself in the classrooms, and I think in that week, the student attendance and engagement is probably the highest because it's colorful, it's creative, it's different. And I thank you again for sharing your insights. I am conscious of time, and it's been a wonderful symposium, and thank you, Xander, and everyone here for your time. And I'm sure the conversations will continue after this. I'm just going to move this session to the next and allow Mariana to do the final words and wrap up of what's been a wonderful symposium. Over to you, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thanks everyone for contributing to that. I guess everybody has joined that session now. Is that correct, Aaron? I can start?
Yes, that's right.
Excellent. Well, what shall I say? I think it has been a long marathon over 2 days, half days, of course, but still it has been a long journey. As you can imagine, there has been a lot of work being done previous to this event to make sure that we are ready and we can deliver what we have promised to you. I hope all of the sessions that you have attended, they have made you to think differently, or you have gained new networks, new ideas, and new inspirations from all the presenters. As I have mentioned at the beginning, don't have the anxiety of the fear of missing out. If you couldn't stay awake or wake up very early to attend any sessions, all sessions have been recorded, and we will be sharing the videos with all the people that they have registered to the events. So I wouldn't like to delay further from any other task that you might have. I would like to sincerely thank all my team, my editorial board, and I guess some of them, they might be here, and you have heard many of them: Mustafa, Joan, Cici, Aaron, who was just speaking before, and of course my volunteering team led by Fanny, who has been a great support and from whom you will be bombarded with thank you letters and the video links after the event. So don't forget about JHTM. Stay in touch, as you probably have realized so far, and I hope you will stay in touch with us through the social media as well. We do have a profile: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. I haven't included Twitter, Instagram. There was no space here, but I'm sure you can find us. We definitely want to involve as many of you as possible in the journal. If you wish to volunteer as a reviewer, please drop me an email. Please submit your papers, read and cite our articles. And if you have any other idea about how to contribute, for example, make a special issue, or even join and help us in one of our future events, either the online symposium, the hackathon, or submit a PhD best paper, please stay in touch. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate your help and for attending. For any feedback, ideas on how we can also improve, I would be really happy to hear from you, and I'm sure the remaining of the team would be happy to liaise with you. I don't know if any of my team members would like to contribute or say any final words. I see Aaron, Mustafa is here. I'm not sure if anybody else.
No, just thank you very much.
Like to say something?
Thank you very much to all for attending this 2 days research symposium. I had the chance to attend some workshop, really the rich and informative workshop. I'm sure all you got many different points from those workshops, and as Mariana said, keep in touch and consider JHTM for submission of your paper, and we will work together to rise higher and put JHTM in higher height. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa. Aaron, any final or you've been exhausted? You have been the host for quite a few sessions in the last hours.
It's been great to see everyone in this domain. I think having it online allows us to meet with people from different parts of the world and hearing their ideas as well. And I think this is something that we treasure and want to continue in different domains in the future.
Thank you. And I see we have Fanny here as well. Fanny, you have been wonderful during the 2 days. Just put a voice behind your face and the background.
Thank you so much. I hope you really enjoy this research symposium. So we will wait for the next year's symposium, maybe. Thank you so much once again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fanny. Great. So I wish you a good afternoon, morning, I don't know, good evening, wherever you are based. And I'm looking forward to hear from many of you in various ways. All the best with your research and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.